Hello. Long Patrol. So, I hope you can hear me. I am watching, as always, the orange dot very carefully on the XSplit broadcaster and hoping that it is recording correctly and not with any twos that are static or anything like that. It always has. These are the notes. You probably can't see it in the daylight from the report into HMS Sydney. So I will be getting into that today. Mainly because, well, it needs to be looked at and explained why I have any disquiet I do. Always explain. So, the Amphion class, the stats. 1930s Royal Navy is trying to build cruisers. Numbers of cruisers. As many cruisers as it can get. It wants them to be as effective as possible, but it needs a lot of them. Basically, how do I put this in a modern reference that people will get? The Royal Navy is trying to turn out so many cruisers because it's not like the Imperial Armada in Star Wars, who are concentrating on the Death Star and these humongous Star Destroyers. They're lovely. It has heavy cruisers. It has battleships. It has aircraft carriers, all these things which you could perhaps consider analogous with the Death Star, with the Star Destroyers, in that they're the capital ships that are focus of force. But its backbone is its cruisers. Its backbone, in terms of its presence around the world, is its light cruisers. Its destroyer force are its aggressive fighters. If you want a Star Wars analogy again, we'll keep it up. We'll call them the equivalent of the X-Wings. They're highly aggressive, highly maneuverable. And they're going to go in for the attack. That is what they're for. But the cruisers are the present ships. And I don't think anyone really in Star Wars movies really has a cruiser knowledge ship. Not the Venators. No, I picked the wrong. Sorry, I do apologize. I picked the wrong Sci-Fi stream to go off in. I don't think. I'm trying to think. Even Star Trek doesn't have, and Star Trek has one of the most comprehensive fleets you can imagine. But none of the major sci-fi's franchises seem to get the cruiser concept. Possibly Stargate. Possibly the Pegasus class. But there again, they're also their capital ships because they don't have anything else, so no. But how they get used? It's a conundrum. Actually, and this is off topic, but please, suggestions of what you think are the equivalent of cruisers in sci-fi, please put below. Also, well, remember, if you like the videos, please do subscribe. Please do press the like button. And please come join us in Discord or Patreon and also press the little bell down there. There are two options for getting an alert of when I have a video going live. There is the join Discord, and then there's an alert channel which comes up and tells you when the video's gone live. For me, for build response, for anything. And there's also a little bell down there. And honestly, the little bell is better if you want to catch the lives, but probably if you are someone who's just wants to be able to go through and find out when there's been a recent update and upload, probably the Discord is better. So the Royal Navy and its concept has been underway for a while. They come out of World War One with a large number of Cs, Ds, and a couple of Es. And that's really the backbone of their force going into the 1920s and at the beginning of the 1930s. These are good general-purpose light cruisers, but they are light cruisers built on the World War I standard. And whilst some of the variants do have far more range than others, and some have been modified, and some have been modified officially, and some have been modified highly unofficially, there is still a limit to their capabilities. Not much of a limit, but a limit. So, the Royal Navy is trying to work out how it's going to approach what it's conceiving for World War II. And you have to remember, what is the Royal Navy conceiving for World War II is a different paradigm to perhaps some of the others. In that, for America and Japan, their conception of the Navy is a war against each other, the next big war. That is what they are really talking about. That's what they're really looking at. Britain is looking at fighting a war around the world, a global war. Its nightmare, as I have said on many previous occasions, is to find itself fighting in the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific at the same time. That's its nightmare. Because no matter how big you are, and there are many, many authors who will sit there and go, the Royal Navy is shrunk to set a third or fourth place in the world because it can't send a mighty fleet to Japan, whilst also fighting against the Italians in the Mediterranean and the Germans in the North Atlantic. Of course it can't. It has to send a deterrence fleet. Why? Because that's its thing. You know, that's the reason why it wants all these cruisers, because of trade protection, because it's got a global empire to defend, and it will have to fight everywhere. And under a treaty system, which is probably better for Britain's economy, and that's certainly what the politicians want to try and ward off war, there is a limitation to what you can build. For Britain to be able to say it was in first place in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, in the North Atlantic, it would have had to build so many ships, because it would have had to have superiority to the US Navy in the Atlantic and in the Pacific in numbers, and superiority to Italy and France probably in the Mediterranean. That's a lot of battleships. That's grand fleet proportions at numbers of battleships. And no one could sustain that for that long. Well, no, you can't. It's the same trouble which America is now coming up to today, because if you think about it, in the Cold War, the world was easy. Everywhere else was a sideshow. Europe was the main focus. So you had your heavy forces in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. You could flick them between there, and everything else was just something you were wandering around in, because what were the odds of China getting involved, or this or that? You know, what did you really need in terms of major fleet capabilities off Vietnam? You needed a carrier group to provide air support. But was there any likelihood of you coming up against another carrier battle group and having to duke it out? No. So you have this sort of scenario where you have a global navy, a nation, global empire, and the Royal Navy's having to defend it. So it's looking at what will deter conflict. What will make it a very not tasty thing to deal with? And in many ways, this is actually it looking at the German strategy and the French strategies in the Napoleonic Wars and the German strategy of World War One, and trying to work out where did you go wrong. And very quickly, they focus in on cruisers. They focus in on the need of keeping their economy going, keeping the trade going, because if you have the money going around, if you have the goods going around, if you're able to move the personnel and equipment around, you stand a chance of actually winning the war, because Britain does have those things in its empire. The Commonwealth and Empire does have those things in large numbers, but you need the protection to be able to move around. You also need to be able to stop the enemies moving around. And that's it, basically. Yes, prepare to fight a battle. You will have to fight a couple, but you will have to, more importantly, wage a war. And there is a difference between fighting a battle at sea and waging a war. Which sounds really strange. But the ocean is ungovernable space. And it's one of the reasons why maritime power has to be studied to understand space power if you're talking about future conflicts in space. Because space is ungovernable. You can govern a planet. The stuff in between it, whether it's Figu or space, as in nothingness, you can put a ship there, and as long as you can maintain it, you can claim you govern that space. But the moment the ship goes away, you don't govern it anymore. And if your ship's there, it's not somewhere else, and that means that space isn't governed. So the sea, space are ungovernable spaces. The only chance you can have at having some control is by having as many ships, capable ships, as possible, so you can have as many spaces of governed territory as possible in the ungoverned space. And that's why you need the cruisers. And that's what the concept is. So let's consider the Leander class. Concept is ordered. They were 6,400 tons. We're going to have about 150 meters long, 40 meters beam, and draft of 5 meters. They were looking for 60,000 shaft horsepower, able to achieve 30 knots or 5,000 nautical miles at 10 knots. They're fairly well armed. And they had an armor, a 3-inch box around the magazines, 1-inch deck armor, and 1-inch turrets. Armor stays the same. The armament stays the same. They end up with having 6 Admiralty free-drum boilers, generating 72,000 shaft horsepower, which is able to give them a top speed of 32.5 knots, and a range of 5,730 nautical miles at 13 knots. So, hey, we've got longer range at higher speed, and we've got a higher top speed. But to get that, they've kind of grown. They're at 7,390 tons or more in standard configuration. We all know that. That's the Washington Treaty definition of standard, which allows the Royal Navy to get away with it's not armor, it's water. Tricks 9,900 tons full. Dimensions have grown by nearly 20 meters, because that's 169.1 meters. So I'm sorry, that's far more than the give or take 10%. Beam is 17.1 meters. Again, that's a growth of 3 meters, which is a growth of more than the 10%. And the draft is 5.8 meters, again, a growth of more than 10%. Remember, usually, the reason I'm talking about the give or take 10% is because when my students are writing an essay, and I give them a target of 3,000 words, and they ask me, what's the maximum? And okay, sometimes it's defined as a maximum of 3,000 words. Sometimes it's considered 3,000 word essay. It's stated as, and there's no maximum to it. And that means there's a 10% margin either way. So if you write 2,700 words, you can still get full marks if they are very good 2,700 words. And if you write 3,300 words, you can also still get full marks. You won't be penalized for going too far over. So 10% is an acceptable margin of error. 3% is a margin of error, is considered the standard margin of error when we are talking about surveys. That's a margin closer to within, let's say, 13, 14%? 14% roughly. That's out by. In terms of dimensions. That's a lot of growth. Why does it grow? Well, because they're trying to work out how to do things. So they go back to the design board and go, right then, we're going to try another go at this. Before we get to that, though, let's consider HMS Leander. Where does she end up? She ends up with the New Zealand Division. She does end up in the Far East. There is no surprise that the Leanders go out to the Far East, that the Amphions, when they go on them, go out to the Far East, go out to Australia. Why? Because Britain's trying to deter war with Japan. How's Britain trying to deter war with Japan? Well, basically going, we'll protect our trade and take out your trade. You're going to require a lot of ships. We're going to tie down a lot of your ships to try and hunt what we'll be going after in your trade. Now, to an extent, the Japanese are worried about this. But of course, when World War II happens, to explain why this goes wrong, World War II starts off with Germany first, so it starts off in the complete worst order as far as the British are concerned. So they start moving things back to the Indian Ocean, to the Mediterranean, slightly reducing Far East, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Then Italy enters the war, to move some more stuff back into the Mediterranean. And finally, in December 1941, Japan enters the war. So you've had losses and you've had to move your stuff to deal with the fact you're fighting a war in the North Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. Then some bright spark, Churchill, has the idea of sending battleships out there to deter Japan. Now, as Force C was originally conceived, it was going to have an aircraft carrier with it, possibly even two. And that would have actually been quite an efficient force. Two fast battleships, well, a battleship and a battle cruiser, and a World War I battle cruiser, which have been, to an extent, upgraded and refitted during the war years, and a couple of aircraft carriers. But the reality is, you can't really, when they sort of originally considering that as an idea of deterrent force to send out there, and first moving what would eventually be turned into the plans which became Force C, but that's, of course, those plans are pre-war. And basically, the idea was a couple of battleships, a couple of carriers would turn up. This was put together roughly in the late 1930s. And that would free up the cruisers to go hunting. So the cruisers, instead of having to protect Singapore and necessarily Australia in full force, you could divide your cruiser group into two on your China station and your Indian Ocean squadron. And those cruisers could be combined up, and the cruisers which have got less stores or less range would stay with the battleships and carriers to form a task group along with some destroyers, which are already out there, and some probably from the Mediterranean. And the others would go hunting. HMS Leander is probably one of the ones which would have gone hunting under that scenario. But of course, war happens, and not only have you lost cruisers, and battleships by this point, by the time December 1941. You've also lost aircraft carriers. You've lost Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal. And they've been damaged as well, and you've got 2 in the repair yards. So Britain starts World War II, well, it's 1939, World War II, with the most aircraft carriers in the world of any naval service. It's got the most. But they're spread around in penny packets around the world. And it's having to concentrate them. And also, war wears down your stuff as well. And you always have to remember, war wears down your equipment. But they don't notice in the 1930s. If they had known in the 1930s, you'd have probably got, earlier 1930s, you'd have probably got Britain breaking the laws for older rules far more and just ramping up construction. If they'd known war was happening in 1939, rather than thinking it was going to be 1942, 43, or 44, 45 in their dreams and fervent hopes, you would have probably seen more Leanders ordered, and certainly more Amphion class. Why more Amphion class? Well, they're just a tad lighter. 7,115 tons. They're a tad longer. If we just go back and check. Yeah. A tad wider and a tad deeper in draft. But they have 4 enhanced Admiralty free drum boilers, which do generate 72,000 shaft horsepower again, thanks to the sort of the pressure they can build up to. And they do again achieve 32.5 knots. But they get 7,000 nautical miles at 16 knots. 3-inch belt armor. 2 to 3.5 inch box around magazines, 1 and an 1/8 inch in the deck armor, and 1-inch turrets. Why can they afford all that, be slightly longer, and still be slightly lighter? Well, because of the arrangement of the engines. You know, they are arranged as they are because that allows them, in a way, to have far more survivability. Leander class have a single funnel. All the boilers are put together, and then all the turbines. So it's a single funnel arrangement. The Amphions class have 2. The reason they have 2 is because you have boilers in turbines. Boilers, engines. Boilers, engines. And this makes them, theoretically, also more survivable, as well as actually, it turns out, slightly more efficient. Although it does, to an extent, extend the space you need to have armored, it's not by that much. It also means it's less likely for a torpedo to take out your whole engine system. And you can redirect steam from the non-primary through auxiliary tubing to the other turbine, to the other engine systems. It's a good system. It is a good system. HMS Perth has an interesting career. It's a very successful career in many ways. Originally, HMS Amphion herself. She would join the Royal Navy, was laid down in June 1933, launched in July 1934, and commissioned in June 1936. She'd served with the Royal Navy for 3 years before transferring to the Royal Australian Navy in June 1939 and being rechristened Perth. Her battle honours would include the Atlantic in 1939, Mattapan convoys, Mattapan, 1941, Malta convoys, also 1941, Greece, Crete, Mediterranean, Pacific, and Sunda Strait. And she's actually sunk during the Battle of the Sunda Strait. She's a good ship. She works hard in World War II and manages to achieve a lot. She's refit a few times and takes part in the Battle of Greece and all sorts of operations, hence the Crete Battle Honour. She's a major part of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. In fact, so much so I have an account here, courtesy of the Naval Historical Society of Australia, from the Battle of Mattapan. The usual dawn stand to, and then it's our breakfast, which was rudely interrupted by an aircraft yellow, immediately followed by air raid red. And much gunfire, but no bombs or torpedoes were dropped, so he presumed rightly that they were reconnaissance planes. Less than half an hour later, a message came over the speakers. Several ships presumed to be enemy are just in the view astern. Stand by for surface action in a few minutes. But the message had hardly died when action stations were sounded. No one lost any time in jumping into their place of duty. About 0800 hours, they opened fire with 8-inch, whilst we raced madly to open the range, not wishing to try our 6-inch against their superior armament. Their gunnery at extreme range of about 20,000 yards was far too accurate for our comfort or peace of mind, as our battle range is 17,000 yards. They were straddling the Orion. Just before they opened fire upon us, we hoisted our battle flags with the flag of Australia at the foremast. Everyone cheered that we were fighting under our very own banner. We spent a very uncomfortable hour and a half dodging in and out of range, with the Dagos dropping them everywhere. One just ahead of us, one right in our wake. Our job was to entice them into a trap, if we could. We were the baited trap, and now I know just what it feels like to be a piece of cheese. The Italians kept firing jubilantly at us, while we kept just ahead, hoping for our battle fleet to appear on the horizon. At any moment. About the middle of forenoon, the enemy turned away 180 degrees and laid a smoke screen. Round we swept to follow them, away from the direction of our main striking force. We had to keep in contact with them at all costs, though it was so unequal for us, and blindly we fell into a self-same trap which we had been luring them. Without warning, we were suddenly startled by 15-inch shells falling about us. We almost sat up on our tail the way we turned, and then with every ounce of speed, under a pool of black smoke, we raced the Dagos at their own game. We had blunders into Italy's new class battleship, Vittorio, or Vittorio Veneto, 32 knots and 15-inch guns, 10 of them. We were racing, 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers, and our dustmen did a job well worth doing to make so much smoke and still retain a high speed. The engineer commander opened up all valves bar the safety valve, which he tied ruthlessly down. The ship at this stage might as well blow up with her boilers as with the high explosives from Musso. 2 little birds had suddenly appeared on the most exposed part of the ship, the Breda gun platform. Don Viney, captain CPTI, is on one gun, and he was very perturbed about them, for they appeared exhausted and thirsty. One bird hurt towards a pool liquid. Don't drink from that, you silly little bird, said Don. It's salt water and oil. Don't you know any better than that? But the bird just gave a cheep and he was thirsty. He very soon found out his mistake, and Don regarded him triumphantly. Now, I suppose you've given yourself a bellyache. Serve you right for not taking notice. Then placed a cup of water on the crane he tried to persuade it to drink, crumbling small pieces of bread for it. All this time, 15-inch shells were dropping around us, the funnels belching plumes of smoke as we tore through the sea at 33.5 knots, racing for our existence. Don and his little feathered friends were quite unconscious of the terror about us. After about 2 hours of racing, an hour of which was under fire, we finally got clear away, and after gasping for breath for a few minutes, looked round for the battle fleet. We eventually picked them up, about 1400s, and very glad to see them we were, and to creep in under the umbrella of Popper and his big boys. The skipper came down and had a little chat with the lads, telling us how badly we had needed our Swede and smoke. The CNC made us to the VAF that we had been made a perfect cruiser's manoeuvre. That's something, anyhow. We can't do much better than perfection. We had plenty of air raid reds during the afternoon, but no attacks. Our formers chased them away. C&C ordered a large-sized load of manure for the Dagos to be delivered at dusk, and shortly before sundown, as we idled along serenely as though it was just a routine sweep and there wasn't such a thing as a hostile fleet within a few miles of us, the sunset painting the usual rara colours, silhouetted against the glowing depths of which could be discerned 9 specks in the sky making their way north towards a low misty smudge on the far horizon, which was the enemy making their way home. Not long afterwards, when the afterglow had just died, a new glow spread to the north, where a gigantic firework display commenced. The sky was filled with bursting shells and tracer shells from their braiders and pom-poms. That lasted for an hour, and when one comes to realise what a job those swordfish pilots had, one has to take one's hat off to them. In the words of Skipper, I think it's the bravest thing a man can do. To carry out a torpedo attack on a battleship, they have to fly low and direct at a target, a perfect sitting shot, and press home their attack in the face of a terrific barrage of AFR. It takes iron nerves and determination to do this, and they deserve any luck that comes their way. They certainly came to our rescue in the morning, when they successfully turned the enemy battle fleet from its attention to us. This night attack was all the more difficult because of the fact that after their attack on the enemy, they had then to fly in the direction of Crete and land on a strange, unlighted, and difficult-to-find aerodromes. This operation was carried out with all success, the squadron leader making the quick cryptic report to C&C have direct hit or sunk a battleship. After this pyrotechnic display, we, the 7th Cruiser Squadron, were sent ahead to make contact with the enemy. The 2nd and 7th Destroyer Flotilla were also dispatched to attack with torpedoes. The night was dark with a brilliant display of stars, which to our eyes seemed as bright as searchlights as we crept forward to within 5 miles of the enemy fleet. The sea was like glass, and as we were about to spread out in a 17-mile sweep, we made contact and closed in again as we shadowed them silently. At 23:30 hours, the night was suddenly rent with dull, shattering booms, and the sky was brightened by star shell and flashes of gunfire spread like sheet lightning in unholy death and glare. Our battle fleet had opened fire at 5,000 yards range by radio direction firing radar, and practically blown 3 8-inch cruisers and 2 destroyers to atoms. Destroyers were sent in to finish them off and pick up survivors. If any C&C told us, and the boats to make ourselves scarce and burn fighting lights. All shapes are the same to me in the dark, he made signal. Destroyers picked up so many out of the water that it is thought that half the crew jumped overboard before ships were actually sunk. One skipper of a destroyer made to C&C have picked up as many survivors as I can carry, fired all my torpedoes, and now have a battleship to deal with. Will I sink her with deck charges or board her? It's not known what the reply the Admiral made. HMS Nubian was told not to try and board her. During the night, or early morning, it came misty, and the enemy scattered and were lost. We lost contact and saw no more of them. Dawn found us some distance from the battle fleet, so C&C made to us come in under the umbrella and enjoy a quiet breakfast after last night's frolic. Very gratefully, we crept in under the all-embracing and powerful protection to have a few hours' peace and quietness. The forenoon passed quietly. At 10:30 hours, we passed over the sea where the night's battle had been fought. The sea was a mass of oil, and a couple of Carly floats were picked up with more survivors on. Last night's bag is thought to include Littorio, 15-inch 32-knot battleship, Italy's latest, Polar, 8-inch cruiser, Finn and Zara, also 8-inch cruisers, 2 large destroyers of the Leander Class. With the sinking of these 3 cruisers, Italy has now lost half the total force of these vessels, which consisted of 7 10,000-ton cruisers at the outbreak of war. Our losses for the entire action? Nil. After dinner, we had several air raid alarms, and at 1600 hours, a force of about a dozen Junkers, 88 dive bombers, carried out an attack upon the fleet. Finders went up from formidable, but the Stukas came on inexorably despite the most terrific umbrella barrage. The sky was a mass of bursting shell, pom-pom tracers, and every other weapon. It's incredible to watch and wonder how anything can live in it. It succeeded in breaking the attack, however, and the bombs that were dropped did no damage at all. 2 Junkers were observed to crash, and half a dozen bailed out. 2 of our planes were lost. It was a terrific attack while it lasted, but the reception was also warm, and I don't think the Huns liked it at all. They concentrated on the formidable, and all the bombs were dropped in her vicinity. One near one entirely obliterated her behind in an immense column of water. It is a terrifying, amazing spectacle. One of our braiders nearly scored a hit. It was a beautiful shot. You could follow the red tracer flashing after Stuka, which was flying away from our port quarter, and only just skidded around a cloud in time. Another second, if he'd kept to his course, it would have got him. Just came to say hello. Mattapan is an interesting battle. It came very close to being far worse for the Italians. There are some signal confusions which go on the British side, and there is some bad luck on both sides. But it's one of those battles that if it had started an hour earlier, there is a very real possibility that there could have been a far bigger battle at night than just 3 cruisers lost. The battleship was damaged, but was repaired. Whether the air attack really did save the cruisers, well, that historians make a lot of judgment on that, but I would leave that up to the people at the time. The sailors aboard the Royal Navy cruisers, the HMAS, the Royal Navy. When I'm saying Royal Navy here, I mean the Australian, the New Zealand, it was a Commonwealth cruiser force, let's put it this way, and a fair number of British ones as well. Although some of them had quite a few South African crewmen aboard as well on top of it, so it's a really interesting mix. Certainly did believe that they were saved. Unfortunately, Formidable will not always leave a charmed life. She does eventually get hit by a very big bomb off Crete. And it's, again, that's the war going on. So when you... This is the point I was making earlier about the war versus the Japanese in the Far East. You've had illustrious damage to the Mediterranean. You've had formidable damage in the Mediterranean. Yes, they achieved Taranto, they achieved Mattapan, and countless other operations were successful because of their presence. You've also had Eagle work to death pretty much in the Mediterranean. She's been pretty much rebuilt after her Mediterranean service because all her components, because of the bombing, because of the high speed, because of the operation, she's an old ship. She was due to be replaced, hasn't been replaced because of the needs of war. And as I said, you lose Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal. Royal largely due to some well, it's going to try and say that one is it's not that it's poor damage control in that they don't want to do counter flooding. You can understand that to an extent, but the rules that the Navy had laid down, the advice was that you did do it, but it was left up to the engineers to make a decision, and they didn't want to flood their ship. That was the enemy's job in their view. We'll leave that to one side. That's completely off topic. Courageous and Glorious, one lost doing anti-submarine sweep, which you should have in no ways have had a full fleet carrier doing. But the thing is, you're just 2 short ships, so you're sending it for them. Arguably, they carry on doing that when they have escort carriers, and that's a perfect sensible use for an escort carrier. If it gets sunk, ouch. You don't want it to get sunk. But you don't use a fleet carrier for it. But the thing is, you don't have escort carriers in the beginning. Well, you don't have enough. You have Argus, which you're trying to work up again. You have Eagle and Hermes. One of those is in refit. It's just, no. As for the other one, unescorted, not sailing the fleet. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. No. There are many people responsible for that. The admiral who let them go without escort, for starters. They should have at least had cruisers with them. They should have most certainly been transiting for battleship, and if you consider later in the war, that would never have happened. It's, to an extent, overconfidence in British superiority in the North Sea and that sort of portion of North Atlantic that they believe they can send such a valuable asset even if it is auxiliary to the battle line, as some people claimed, some admirals felt, but honestly, the admirals who seem to be in command, none of them seem to think that. Well, no, perhaps Lord Cork and Ornery, but we'll leave that to one side. You know, if you'd had those three carriers, around, maybe you would have had a second carrier in the Mediterranean for Taranto. You might have had Ark Royal down with them. You'd probably actually had Ark Royal still with Force H in the French Underworld, but you could have had Courageous or Glorious backing up Illustrious. Had a couple of fleet carriers there. That could have caused a far larger impact on Taranto. If you'd had a couple of carriers and the significant, far larger size of air group and maintenance facilities available, you might well have been able to keep had far more fighters available in later on in the war, and for air defense of the fleet. Well, you would have had more fighters. You'd have had more fighters out there. Air crews, maintainers, all these things are lost with Courageous and Glorious and Courageous and Glorious. Okay? Lots of people, lots of very skilled people are lost. So it's war. Both sides lose. The difference is made is how you handle those losses and whether you can recoup them. But Mattapan is not her last major battle in the case of Perth. In fact, she goes on to the Sunda Strait, where she and USS Houston have, well, they both get lost. But again, the reason I'm talking about aircraft carriers, the reason I'm talking about this all the time, is because so many of this class do end up being lost in the Far East. And especially, more suspectedly, the Battle of Sunda Strait. If Force Z doesn't get sunk because it has carriers with it, let's say it has a carrier or two with it, and probably would have some destroyers with it as well if it had a carrier with it, and would therefore have fighter air defense breaking up the enemy attacks, and probably would also be coordinating better with the land-based air to support it, because the fighter direction units, the best units, are the ones aboard the carriers in 1941. There are some cruisers coming through which are getting sort of starting to be used for it, but they're mostly in the Mediterranean for convoys, especially convoys to Malta, so they're not going to be there. It's going to be your aircraft carrier. The fate of the war could have been very, very interesting. But that wasn't the be, and Abda had the fate it did. Battle of Sunda Strait, 26th of February, 1942. They departed. Battle of Sunda Strait is, of course, in March 1942. The ship, HMS Perth, departed Sambara in company with the Dutch light cruisers, the Reuter and Java, the heavy cruisers USS Houston and HMS Exeter, two Dutch, 3 British, and 4 US destroyers. The squadron was under the command of Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. They proceeded along the north coast of Mandura Island, searching for a Japanese invasion convoy. After they reach Sunda, they Surabaya, and they refuel. They hear that there is a Japanese fleet has been sighted to the north. Doorman decides to immediately go north to engage. He's doing the same as Phillips in Force C. He's not doing the wrong thing. Okay? The job of the naval force at this point is deterrence, and they can only deter if they can't deter by disappearing in the face of the enemy. They have to try and fight them off, and if the enemy's fleet's small enough, beat them up and win. Again, imagine if there was a Force Z with aircraft carriers still going, battleships still going around, but Abda to form around. At this point, the Japanese would have to been far more careful, far more circumspect, far less aggressive in some of their handlings, or would have to send far larger fleets, which would put a strain on their infrastructure and their support things. In the ensuing Battle of Java Sea, fought over the night from the 27th to 20th of February, the Allied force was soundly defeated by a Japanese force, which was able to exploit its superiority over the four-nation Allied force in terms of long-range gunnery, torpedoes, night fighting, the freshness of its crew, and its homogeneity. Basically, Abda didn't have enough time to fight to all work together. Just didn't. Dutch cruisers were sunk and Exeter badly damaged, while most of the destroyers were sunk or withdrew as their torpedoes were exhausted. Perth and Houston were able to break off the action with the Japanese and sailed to Tanjung Priok, where they refueled. Orders were received for the cruisers to sail through the Sunda Strait for Chidajat on Java's south coast that next day. And so on the 20th at 7 p.m. on the 20th of February, they set course to the west of the Strait. Perth leading and Houston 5 cables to the stern. At 11:06 p.m., they met the Japanese invasion force assigned to Western Java. In the initial phase of the action, they have destroyers coming from all directions. And so they don't manage to engage all of them. With the limited number of turrets they only have 4 turrets, they have far more destroyers. But they still don't suffer much damage in the initial phase of the operations. At about midnight, it was reported that the cruiser had little ammunition left. So Captain Waller, that's the commanding officer of HMAS Perth, decided to attempt to force a passage through Sunda Strait. He ordered full speed and turned the ship south for Topper's Island. Perth had barely steadied a new course when a torpedo struck her in the starboard side. Captain ordered the crew to prepare to abandon ship. A few minutes later, another torpedo struck just forward and the first hit, and Captain Waller gave the order to abandon ship. After 5 to 10 minutes, a third torpedo struck well aft on the starboard side, followed shortly by a fourth on the port. Perth managed to sink about 12:25 a.m. on the 1st of March. Houston, still fighting, but ablaze, was also hit by torpedoes and sunk shortly afterwards. Of the Perth's company of 686, which included 4 civilian canteen staff and 6 Royal Australian Air Force personnel for operating and servicing our aircraft, only 218, including 1 civilian and 2 RAAF, were repatriated. The remainder were killed during or soon after the action, or died as prisoners of war. Captain Waller was lost with his ship. HMS Hobart. I like Hobart. Wrong button. Hobart survives World War II, believe it or not. She's the only one of the class who does. She starts off as HMS Apollo, and she's laid down in August 1933, launched October 1944, commissioned January 1936, and sold to the Royal Australian Navy in 1938, where she's commissioned in September 1938. Her battle honours include Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Coral Sea, Savo Island, Guadalcanal, Pacific, East Indies, and Borneo. She's not sold for scrap till 1962, and she's not decommissioned till 1947. So she presumably spends roughly 15 years sitting around, not sure what they're going to do with her. It's a shame, really. She could have been preserved. Paid off into reserve fleet in 47. She suffers torpedo attacks and all sorts of things during World War II, but she managed to get rebuilt and survives. And so, does well. And I have an account for her of her story, her history. The Battle of Coral Sea for her. Cyril Rayner's account, again courtesy of the Naval Historical Society of Australia. After refit, Hobart was based at Dunk Island inside the Barrier Reef, which provided excellent natural torpedo defense and provided an opportunity to stretch our legs ashore and play sport. There were several months of dull routine, with 10-day patrols into the Coral Sea, followed by 3-day rests at Dunk or Palm Islands. It was during this period that beer became available from the storeships Mercure, with 2 bottles per day being issued to all hands when in harbour. Beer has arrived. Almost as good as iron brew. In March 1943, Task Force 74 was formed, comprising the cruisers Australia, Hobart, and Phoenix. 7 US destroyers, plus HMAS ships Aranta and Warramunga. Task Force, at last free of the reef, joined with the 7th Fleet at Espiritu Santo on the 16th of July. A few days before this, on the 1st of July, there was a cause for minor celebration as Cyril was promoted to Lieutenant, Provisional, Royal Australian Naval Reserve. After a patrol to the west of the New Hebrides, which had been in clear weather with slight seas, the flagship Australia, Hobart, and 3 US destroyers returning to Espiritu Santo. The ships were in defence watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, and steaming at 23 knots under a zigzag plan. Australia was in the van, followed at 600 yards by Hobart, with the destroyers in a standard anti-submarine screen around the cruisers. One 2,200 yards ahead, and the others at 2,700 yards distant, 60 degrees on each bow. On 20th July, at about 18:45, the sun had certain it was getting dark. The officer on the watch in the Hobart, the newly promoted Cyril Rayner, could be well satisfied with his lot, expecting a run ashore the following day with the attraction of seeing American nursing sisters. But there was a mighty explosion on the ship, as the ship was hit on its port quarter. Machinery went dead, all lighting was lost, and the 60-ton Y turret was lifted off its mounting with its guns pointed at crazed angles. The officers of watches urgently calls down to the voice pipe to his captain went unheard. The executive officer, Commander James Walton, lay seriously wounded, but the situation was calmed as the normally taciturn First Lieutenant Commander Christopher Johns, our Royal Navy, who happened to be on the bridge at this time, and quickly took charge until the captain's arrival. Lieutenant Commander Johns ordered stop engines in action stations and later made contact with damage control parties to help assess the situation. With the captain on the bridge, permission was obtained to fire star shell to illuminate the horizon, but no contacts were reserved. The engineering staff worked tirelessly in restoring emergency services. The ship with 2 of its 4 propellers and its rudder blown off in the explosion, now listing to port, was able to restore some power sufficient to make headway, using one propeller at fixed revs and the other at variable revs to provide direction. A speed of about 7 knots was obtained. In addition, a large steel cable was placed under the gunwale to help secure the stern section. The casualties resulted from the explosion with 14 men killed, including a young USN liaison officer, with a further 16 wounded. The torpedo had missed the after magazine by 6 feet. If this had been penetrated, it's doubtful if the ship would have survived. A later report by the commanding officer of the Japanese submarine IGO-11 confirmed that she had fired a pattern of torpedoes at Australian cruisers when at extreme range of about 10 miles, with a running time of about 12 minutes. These were intended for the lead ship, Australia, but only one found its target, Hobart. For unexplained reasons, possibly having no further torpedoes, the submarine retired. Hobart limped off, supported by screening US destroyers, and next day went through the grim task of committing the dead to the deep. That evening they met with US tugs who assisted the ship in passing through Bougainville Strait. Early the following morning, 22nd July, they were able to find the safety of anchorage at Espiritu Santo. Hobart was not a lone casualty, with a number of ships suffering similar damage, including 2 USN cruisers, and surprisingly, another near-sister ship, HMNZS Leander, which had been badly mauled by a Japanese cruiser a week previously. Vital support was soon forthcoming from the repair ship USS Vessel, including the use of then Naval underwater cutting and welding equipment. The USN constructor officer who examined the damage said, "A nip torpedo makes a hole 60 feet by 30 feet, and you are true to pattern." The USN repair group works tirelessly around the clock, including 10 divers, who worked for over a week cutting away and replacing torn plating. Board of Inquiry established on board Hobart on 22nd July under the presidency of Captain Harold Farnacombe, DSC, Royal Australian Navy, assisted by 2 officers from HMS Australia. Cyril gave evidence to the inquiry. In summary, the board found the cruiser was in all probability hit by one of a pattern of standard Japanese 21-inch torpedoes fired by an unknown enemy submarine firing at extreme range, and that the remainder of the pattern had passed the stern of Hobart. 2 cruisers and the 3 remaining screening escort destroyers, which were all fitted with radar, had no knowledge of any service contact, and that because of the speed advance, sonar was ineffective. The officers and men of HMS Hobart acted appropriately, and the high degree of professionalism, especially that displayed by the engineering and damage control bodies, was of great credit and helped save the ship from further disaster. With temporary repairs completed, Hobart sailed from Espiritu Santo on 21st of August, being able to make passage at 12 knots accompanied by Arunta and Warramunga, and safely made Kakatu Island dockyard for more extensive repairs. Devastation caused by a single torpedo would keep Hobart out of the front line for 12 months, until December 1944 that she recommissioned and once more returned to the Pacific campaign. They had an interesting war. They really do have an interesting war, the Amphion class. Hobart goes through the whole war and is able to take part in the surrender of Japan. She's one of the first cruisers in. And she's important because she's the Australian presence for the surrender to Japan. In many ways, she's one of the most visible presences because of where she positions herself in the harbour. Her career post-World War II reflects, well, the Australians go for battles over darings because the larger cruisers are felt to be better escorts for the carriers. While Australia has a carrier, the larger destroyers are felt to be better. They're more cost-effective. They're better for growing your service because they allow for more command experience to be achieved. But the original idea is that Hobart will be kept around as a training cruiser. She's not, which is a sad thing. It is sad. She does well. I'd like to have seen her preserved, mainly because she did so much, but also she's the only survivor of her entire class. The one which survives World War II, and they all do so much for the Royal Australian Navy around the world. Because, again, World War II is a global war. It's one of the things which gets understood and misunderstood sometimes. And, again, the thing that gets misunderstood quite a lot is how much of a British and Commonwealth presence there was in the Pacific campaign from the get-go. Because there had to be. Because Australia and New Zealand were there. Because the Indian Ocean was there. You don't hear much about it, but it's there. And they're there the whole way through the war. There are British officers. There are British... You have to always remember the Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Indian Navy, the Royal New Zealand Navy in World War II are more like being one navy in terms of how their officers are trained, how their officers are intermixed, and how you can get appointments from. We need an engineering officer. We're short on. Does the Royal Navy has one? Yes. Send them across. Or it moves around. It's more and more one navy in terms of World War II. Right. HMS Phaeton, then HMS Sydney, as she became. And she is laid down in 1933, launched in 1934, christened as Phaeton, and commissioned in September 1935. But she's renamed prior to her launch because she is pretty much ordered straight off the slip by the Australian government. Why? Because they know they need cruisers. Why does Australia, why does New Zealand want cruisers? Why aren't they racing after battleships? Again, it goes back to the whole science fiction thing. And again, I'm really serious about this. If you have ideas for where cruisers turn up in televisual science fiction, there are a fair number of written ones which I could point to, including Empire Rising series, that excellent one, which will be featuring the Sci-Fi cruise ships. Where there are cruisers. But in a television one, I can think of ones which are called cruisers, but they're far more used as capital ships. They are capital ships. They're not cruisers. They're not present ships. I'm trying to think of what's the present ship. Intrepid class from Star Trek? Not really sure. There's not enough really of them built to go around be doing that. No, I can't think of it. So, HMAS Sydney. She leads a charmed life while she's in service. I mean, she literally does lead a charmed life. This ship goes through battles, like, Calabria, Spada, Mediterranean, Komoran. HMS Sydney is a battle fiend. Which battle is there I want to talk about most? There's one battle I really, really want to talk about. Yep. The Battle of Cape Spada. It's one of the lesser known ones, but basically, there are 4 destroyers conducting an offensive sweep. They are conducting an offensive sweep off Crete to try and stop Italian convoys and merchant ships getting through. 2 Italian light cruisers. They are the Giovanni de Belle Bande Nere and the Bartolomeo Coneri. Both of the Gisiano class. The really, really light cruisers under Ferdinando Casardi, who's a fairly decent Italian admiral, all in all. Come down and attack them. Now, what's interesting with the Battle of Cape Spada, and I do have a map of it somewhere. The Battle of Cape Spada, the interesting thing about it is that the Royal Navy, the HMS Sydney is supposed to be one place. She's been assigned the job of, how to put this? Well, okay. They were assigned roles of patrolling the Gulf of Athens for Axis warships and shipping, but also to provide cover to the destroyer force, which was doing their own sweep north of Crete, and also doing an anti-submarine one. The destroyers involved were Hyperon, Ilex, Hero, and Hasty. Sydney's backup was HMS Havoc, another H-class destroyer. So there's 4 H-class destroyers and Ilex, which is one of the 9 I-class destroyers. A good little ship. Slightly more modern than the H-class, but, you know, it's mostly an H-class group. And so he is supposed to be in one position, and they're supposed to be over there, but the idea is that they will be able to retreat back on him. Captain John's is, how do I put this? Captain John Collins. Sorry. He's a independently minded officer, but he's also someone who's going to read the situation. And he decides that, frankly, those 4 destroyers out there are going to present a very tempting target to Italians doing a similar operation to what he's doing. So he changes his angle of approach. So he is 100 miles south of their position, rather than being 150 miles sort of west of their position. And keeps radio silent. Doesn't tell anyone he's there, but he's there. When the 4 destroyer force get attacked by the Italian cruisers, those ships proceed as a turn sort of northeast at 30 knots and start broadcasting news of the attack. So, I said he's 100 miles. He's 100 miles north. He's moved 100 miles north. He's supposed to be northeast, northwest of them, and they're heading northeast now. Sorry. Map is a little muddled. And he's keeping silent. And the first, the Italians realize that there is actually a proper cruiser, because here's the thing. The Ghisania class are really, really lightly designed. Their job is to hoover up destroyers. That is what they're designed for. So yes, they do carry 4 twin 6-inch guns, which means on paper, they are able to match in. However, their decks have 20mm armor. Their belt is 24mm of armor. Their turrets have 23mm of armor. And they have a 40mm tower of armor. So, yeah. They are pretty much built like they are a 6,000-ton destroyer. Collins basically sets a rather nasty ambush because the destroyers come screaming up in his direction. He's slightly off to the side. The Italians are going after him, chasing after destroyers, and suddenly, boom, boom, boom. Hello. Have you met me? I'm HMS Sydney. I'm here for your party entertainment. Anyway, they have fun. They're Gisanio class cruisers of the Condottieri type. I should precise that. I use Condottieri type in the slide because they're of that type of really, really light cruiser. That is pretty much a rather large destroyer. Basically, at 8:20 a.m., the Italian cruisers are sighted, and as I said, they go boom. Hoist the battle engines, starts engaging. And very quickly, Sydney manages to account for which of the battleships? Which of them? Not the Giovanni. The Bartholomew Colony. The DL Brandy Ned will be, if I remember correctly, sunk by HMS Urge. The following year. Well, no, April 1942. But Bartholomew Colony is sunk during the Battle of Spada. So she takes out an Italian cruiser at extreme range. And then she basically returns to Sydney, returns to Alexandria, flying national flag and rousing cheers of the Mediterranean fleet. So she does well. Afterwards, lots and lots of reports. This is where she starts to get a lot of press attention. And as you can see, she's rather burnt off a lot of ammunition. She's fired 956 rounds of 6-inch shell. She's had a lot of firepower go through that and really burnt her turrets from the inside out. Well, the barrels. Admiral Cunningham visits Sydney to personally congratulate Captain Collins' crew. He has to recall in his memoirs, for this fine, brisk action, which showed the high efficiency and magnificent fighting qualities of the Royal Australian Navy, Captain Collins was immediately awarded the commission Companion of the Bath by His Majesty, a well-deserved honour. He was dispatched to the Admiralty. The credit for the successful and gallant action belongs mainly to Captain J.A. Collins, who, by his quick appreciated situation, offensive spirit, and resolute handling of HMS Sydney, achieved a victory over a superior force which has had important strategical effects. It is insignificant that, so far as known, no Italian service forces have returned into or near the Aegean since this action was fought. In other words, by being hundreds of miles out of position, and being completely not telling anyone what he was doing or where he was, he gave us a victory. So now we're going to applaud him. This is the Royal Navy in World War II. Now, Stormy Petrel, we've decided that is. Nickname, the Stormy Petrel. And the Stormy Petrel, I think, is, I found it in a book and put it in there, but I think they've misidentified it, and so I've gone with that book. I've typed that book in, but I'm going to note it. It's actually the Stormy Petrel. And for Australian news of Sydney's victory dominated the newspapers. So she becomes a very, very famous ship. And there is no surprise that after World War II, the next HMS Sydney is an aircraft carrier, the pride of the Royal Australian Navy. Currently, she's a Hobart class air warfare destroyer. Not as fun as an aircraft carrier, but she was a very good aircraft carrier, and better than the guided missile frigate, which she was for about 35 years. I know, it's weird to talk about these things, but, she goes Town-class light cruiser in World War One. Cool. Leander class light cruiser in World War Two. Well, Amphion class light cruiser, let's be honest, in World War Two. Majestic class light aircraft carrier until 1973, so she's very high status. And then 7 years later they go, well, we're going to make you a frigate. What? What happened to me? Why did I drop so? And now, destroyer. So going back up again. Now, the Komoran. That's a simple telling of facts. Sydney sailed from Fremantle on Armistice Day, 11th November 1941, to escort the troop Zealandia to Sunda Strait, where she was relieved by British cruiser HMS Durban, D-class cruiser, for the last leg of the voyage to Singapore. The voyage was without incident, and at noon on 17th November, Zealandia was turned over to Durban, and Sydney then proceeded back to Fremantle, where she expected to arrive on the afternoon on 20th November 1941. She never arrived. Now, when she is lost to the Komoran, she is put under the command of Captain Joseph Burnett, who is one of the experts on surface raiders and on the situation going on in terms of the Atlantic and the Far East, where you need as many merchant ship hulls as you can possibly get to move supplies around the Empire. Our account comes from survivors of the Komoran. There are no survivors of Sydney. And I won't sit here going, I think they're lying or anything like that. I don't. I do think it means we don't have any idea what the other side are thinking. We only have one side of the conversation. So this is my point. Okay? We have the tale from the Komoran crew about what flags they're flying and all these things. That's fine. I think they're honest. But we don't know how the Sydney interprets them. We don't know what's going on the bridge. We don't know that conversation. We are entirely thinking about what's that going on there based on the information of one side, which has no idea what's going on there. We do know both ships end up being sunk. According to the Komoran, Sydney challenged the vessel continuously using her searchlight, while at the same time closing the range between the two ships. Merchant vessels were known to be less efficient at visual signal, and the Germans exploited this knowledge through their actions on their flag deck and their slow responses to Sydney's visual challenges. At 1700 hours, to further deception, Komoran broadcast a suspicious ship message, feigning a cry for help in the name of Strait Malacca. Why doesn't she launch her amphibious aircraft? Why doesn't she launch her aircraft to go and get a visual inspection? Could it have a mechanical issue? I found it being run up, it had fuel, but it isn't launched. We have no idea why it isn't launched. We weren't there. It would seem normal to have launched the aircraft to do a closer inspection, rather than getting so close yourself. If you consider the previous action at Cape Spada, where she'd won her battle, that had been a very long range, 10 miles. But they're getting close. Now, it's also worth noticing, while she has theoretically superior armament, that's mainly superior armament at range. Superior armament at range because of fire control and other things she can have. It is known that she's well within the fire control range of Komoran by the time of the fight. By the time they start fighting. There is also something I find interesting about how little damage Komoran claims to have taken, but when you look at the actual shipwreck of the Komoran and you take into account that, you find out that they took more damage than they necessarily remembered. But they do seem to have had a far more orderly evacuation, and they don't seem to have been as far as much. After the fight, with her bow low in the water, Sydney then turned sharply towards Komoran as though attempting to ram. As she did so, the top of B turret was blown off and flew overboard. The cruiser then passed under Komoran's stern, heading to the southward and losing way. Komoran, maintaining her course and speed, was now on fire in the engine room, where hits by Sydney's X-turret had caused severe damage. Smoke from the fire hid Sydney from Komoran's bridge, but the raider continued to engage with her afterguns as the range opened to approximately 4,400 yards. About 7:45 as Sydney was seen to fire a torpedo. This has been shown to when we looked at her torpedoes, it doesn't seem she did fire them, but in the terms of a wreck. If it did fire, it could have been fired accidentally, but that seems unlikely. Sydney crippled and on fire from the bridge to the after funnel, steam slowly to the south, returning only sporadic fire from a secondary armament. Although by now, again, we're not sure if that secondary armament is actually firing. It could just be shells going off due to the fire. The fact is, we have no accounts from what's on Sydney. We only have the accounts they can see. And I would point out, before anyone sits there going, well, the fire was raging inferno. We know from what the Cormoran sees, the fire is a raging inferno. We know from looking at parts of ship that fire certainly touched a lot of it. But we also know at the Battle of Taranto that one of the pilots presumed that all his colleagues were dead because of the sheer weight of fire going on over their heads versus what there wasn't going underneath. My suspicion is that Sydney was very badly damaged. I'm not sure who's in charge and what kind of chain of commando is operating at this point. We're told the bridge has been knocked out, but that doesn't take out all the senior officers, because not all the senior officers are on the bridge. So what are they trying? What are they thinking? What are they doing? It's not an entire crew of several hundred. Now, I don't agree with any of the conspiracy theories. I don't think there was a conspiracy theory. I'm not saying anything happened that didn't happen. My interest is what was going on HMS Sydney. And that's probably a question I will never be able to answer, because Unless you were there, you won't know. First point. Captain Burnett was aware that there had been radar activity in the Indian Ocean, and while he may not have been alerted to the presence of one particular radar, should have been extremely cautious approaching any unknown vessel. However, it was common practice for warships to close to unknown ships to identify them and prevent scuttling. It was Captain Burnett's and his crew's misfortune that a practice that had worked on their other occasions should end up so disastrous during this occasion. The account engagement, as given by the Germans, is feasible given the very few of the Komoran survivors would have been in a position to be privy to all the command decisions taken and to all the aspects of the engagement. Both Sydney and the Cormorant fought a fierce battle with bravery and great tenacity. While Sydney was mortally wounded, she had inflicted so much damage on Cormoran that the German ship had to be scuttled as well. Subsequently, in 2005 and again 2000, the Australian government agreed to fund a search in area derived from Captain Dementors, that's the captain of Cormoran, account. The search was carried out in March 2008, and the wrecks of the Cormoran and Sydney were found on 12th and 16th March 2008, respectively. Modern technology allowed video and still photography of the wrecks to be taken and analysed. This provided empirical evidence against which the German account could, for the first time, be measured. Accordingly, the Chief of Defence Force established this inquiry to inquire into the circumstances associated with the loss of HMS Sydney in November 1941 and consequent loss of life and related events subsequent thereto. So, Sydney's forward turrets were apparently put out of action by the explosion caused by the torpedo, and the Sydney's aircraft, which is reported to have been warming up at the time when the engagement began, was shot to pieces. I think it launched earlier. As I said, it could have been delayed due to maintenance, all sorts of issues. But again, you're getting one side perspective. We see an aircraft on deck, we're presuming it's warming up. Now, if we go through this report, and it's kind of interesting. Analysis of the observable state of the wrecks of Sydney and Cormoran shows the following. Sydney suffered a torpedo strike on the port side, about 20 metres from the bow and adjacent to a turret. Sydney suffered at least 41 15-centimetre shells hits prior to her port side. Sydney suffered at least 46 15-centimetre shell hits to her starboard side. So she's had 87 6-inch shell hits. There was fire damage to the entire bridge structure and across the breadth of the forecastle deck, down to the lower deck hull on the port side and the upper deck hull on the starboard side. Midships below the aircraft platform and across the upper deck, into the after superstructure, an aircraft deck on the port side and after superstructure on the starboard side, below the after control position. The upper deck was burnt below X turret, and the starboard hull lower deck was burnt around the site of a shell impact. 5 ships' boats were found in the debris field. Some show fragmented damage. Shell trajectory revealed by penetration to the port side whaler suggests the flat trajectory of shell fire and thus closer proximity between ships. The bridge and fire directed control tower were severely damaged. All Sydney 16-inch guns were orientated to port. The 4-inch guns are orientated to both port and starboard. 3 of the 4-inch guns are elevated. Sydney's 4 starboard torpedoes have not been fired. 3 of them remaining in their tubes and 4 found in the debris field. 2 of the port torpedoes remained in the tube, making it clear Sydney fired only 2 port torpedoes. The forward position of Cormoran's hull remains intact and is not damaged by gunfire. The stern portion is missing, a widely scattered debris field consistent with explosion of the stern portion. basically that backs up quite a lot of the damage of the German accounts, and so that does give a fairly good account. But it's the sinking with no survivors thing, and the expect is that she was subjected to additional small arms fire, 3.37 centimeter, and multiple 20mm gun machine guns. She suffered severe fires. It can be assessed by confidence. By the time battle ceased, there were measured casualties on board, probably in the order of 70% of her complement. Okay. 70% of 645. 645, yeah. That still leaves in the order of 192, 194 people still alive. They didn't get any message off because their radio wasn't working, being smashed up, presumably. And they don't have any lifeboats. They do have Carly floats, and one's found, but doesn't get them. So, it's interesting is what's going through their mind. Are they still... Because the thing is, yes, the ships are moving, yes, it's night, etc. But are they trying to get off the ship? Or do they still think they can keep the ship afloat? Suffering that much damage, why haven't they ordered abandon ship crew earlier? What is going on? And I think the thing I think is I think they thought that they could manage the damage. I think they thought they could get it under control. Because that explains to me more about why they're still on the ship instead of trying to get off that ship. Yes, there are flames which are blocking off certain areas, but probably the bow, but I would expect more damage was done to the bow. The stern, there are ways you could have got out. Yes, they could have all been blocked, and so that could be... But it's already had enough bad luck. If that's already happening, that's even more atrocious. Studies have shown that once the sea state reached 4, Sydney, with her torpedo and shell damage, had no prospect of remaining afloat for more than 4.5 hours, regardless of her heading. As she sank, some internal spaces would have been intact and full of air. Given the speed of her sinking, the exploding external water pressure would have caused the intact compartments to implode. There is vision of internal implosion in Sydney's hull. And that is it. I think the crew was still fighting. This is the reason I think the crew went down the ship. I think they were still fighting inside the ship, and the sea state got ahead of them. That is what I was thinking was going on. But we'll never know. I'd love to know if that crew was still fighting, if they were still trying to keep their ship afloat, get their ship home. The ship, you are taught, is your best life raft. And she was the pride of a nation. She had done a Getting to Know You cruise. She'd done all sorts of things. So she's not just the pride of the nation, she's the pride of the men aboard the ship. She's their home, their family. They've just lost all their mates. They don't want to lose their ship as well. I think the reason she goes down with all crew, and I think the reason, That's where all the conspiracy theories kind of seem to spring from. How she went down, why she went down with all crew. I think the reason she went down with all crew was that crew was still fighting to save their ship. I think they thought she should still survive. I think they thought they could get her to port. Which suggests to me that one of the surviving officers, there was some surviving officers, and one of them was a surviving officer, was one of the engineers. That wouldn't surprise me, again, because of the spaces they're in, but I think they had got things to an extent where they thought they could get control of it. They might not have got control of the fires, of everything before she went down, but I think they thought they could get control of it. And then the sea state happens. And there's only so much damage a ship can take. So, that was the Amphion class long patrol. I hope you enjoyed it. It's an interesting topic, the Amphion class. They're very cool ships. It's sad they're also lost, but it's also interesting that the crew builds up. They all seem to have a strong spirit, a strong soul within them, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And as I said, my answer to the question, probably Bill Trumps will look into this at some point, more of why why there are no survivors from Sydney is, and I can never prove this, of course, is I think they were still fighting to save their ship, their home, their family, their friends, and so by the time it did sink because of the sea state rising and changing, there was no time to get off the ship. There are many people who will point to the fragmentation damage of lifeboats and go, da-da-da-da-da. It makes it impossible. But they also probably suffered quite a lot of damage in the sinking of the ship. It was a very violent, sudden sinking of the ship, which caused implosions of internal spaces and all sorts of things. Really not a good experience. That will also damage the lifeboats, as the boats as they go down. If you are concentrating on abandoning ship and you still have crew, you affect temporary repairs. You get canvas out of lockers. There's all sorts of things you do to wrap around those boats and you get them off. The reason we know that is because crews did that when they were trying to get off their ships. But if they're not doing that, and considering there are enough, we're presenting 70% losses. That's a tremendous amount. That is an absolutely ungodly amount. And you've got to include in that probably everyone on the bridge. If anyone from the bridge has survived, they were very, very lucky. But 70% is not 100%. And as I said, my suspicion is that crew was still fighting with nature, with the damage, to try and get their ship home when nature won. So why weren't more of Amphion class built? Why only 3? Why only 3 modified Leanders? Well, because they start building the Town class and they start building the Aerofuser class. Because the Leander and the Amphions aren't small enough to build in the numbers to do the trade protection. And they aren't big enough or powerful enough, really, to be enough of a threat for the commerce raiding and the presence mission. It's the 8 6-inch guns. If they'd had 12, they'd be a town class. They'd also be a lot bigger. But we'll get into them in the future. They did well. They have a tremendous amount of battle honours. They served the Royal Australian Navy and the Australian people with tremendous honour and pride. And they acquit themselves amazingly. One is lost in Sunda Strait in a battle against overwhelming odds. The other is lost in the perfect storm of enemy fire, bad luck, pushing your own luck, and nature. And one survives tremendous damage to continue serving throughout the war and be there from the beginning to the end and serving into the Cold War. The Amphion class, despite none of them in service with the Australian Navy being called the Amphion, are in many ways the genesis of the modern Australian Navy and its fighting spirit. Yes, they get some great tribal class destroyers, and that inures it and accelerates it. And post-Second World War, they get battle class, and they get all sorts of ships, and eventually some daring class. So they get really, really good destroyers. But it's their cruiser forces in the interwar period, and particularly these brand new, practically built for them ships, which are critical to what the Royal Australian Navy becomes. And therefore, as said, it's no surprise that the next HMAS Sydney is an aircraft carrier. It's also no surprise that the current destroyers are the Hobart class. And I'm just trying to remember. I had a note about HMAS Perth. And Perth has been a class of guided missile destroyers and was, until recently, an Anzac class frigate. I think actually still in service. Yeah. Just upgrade, had her midlife capability assurance program upgraded. Although that means if she's not going to be out of service for a while, that is doubtful that perhaps the Type 26s, I think the Royal Australians are going to have a perf later on. Ah, well. Sad times. Really, considering it, and considering that, you know, the Australians got 3 Hobart-class destroyers, it should have been Hobart, Sydney, and Perth, but, you know, these things happen. Brisbane's got it instead. They broke up the trio. I just don't understand. They broke up the trio. It's terrible. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed this. Remember, if you do like these, please do subscribe, press the like button, maybe press the little bell, and come join us on Discord or Patreon for more of a conversation if you want to ask more questions. Thank you. Have a nice day.